So we're now going to go ahead with policy, and to this morning's policy block, the first one is a presentation about adopted IPv4 waitlist policy recommendation, and the presenter is, well, me, because this is a little bit unusual. This is not something that went through the full policy process. This went through a section of the policy development process that handles expedited and emergency actions. So I'm going to talk about the recent change to the IPv4 waitlist policy, and then we'll take questions on it. So in February 7th, 2019, the ARIN board suspended the waitlist issuance from the policy that allows people to qualify, be put on a wait list, and then when address space is available, obtain a block. We took the issuance part, the last part of that policy, and said, nope, it's in suspension. The reason that occurred, you can go find it in the archive, is because we had credible knowledge that the waitlist policy, which at that time allowed any request that we didn't have the space for to be put on hold until we did, was being used by parties to obtain very large blocks under fraudulent terms that were very hard to stop. And once those blocks are obtained, someone who gets a very large block, /16 or /17, /18, has high financial value and prevents dozens of community members who have smaller requests. So because the waitlist policy was being used in this manner, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't damage the community in the process, we put the policy issuance on hold. We would not issue, and we actually went to AC and said, here's the problem. The AC came back and said, let's think about a change to the waitlist policy, and that ended up being given to us as a first draft on the 29th of April, and it was the Advisory Council recommendation regarding NRPM 418 unmet requests. It was a staff and legal review. It was published to PPML for discussion. We incorporated the updates. It was reviewed and adopted by the ARIN board, and it was put into production in July, and we resumed, under this modified policy, we resumed the waitlist issuance. Basically, the suspension was done because misuse of number of resources. The policy development process allows us to strike completely or suspend policy if we believe that there's a material issue, harm to the community. The AC recommendation, the update, when it was adopted, calls for putting a limit that the maximum aggregate that can be put on the list is a /22, and only that if organizations hold less than /20 or less of IPv4 address space, and that upon receiving address space, you won't be eligible for a transfer for a period of 60 months. If you just waited for address space and you receive it, then that address space that you receive, we expect you'll be using for years. And so we applied that policy and then opened the wait list and began issuance. We went to everyone on it who met the policy and told them, you can now get a block of 22 or smaller, and adjusted all the entries. The AC recommendation includes provisions that once you've received address space, you can't apply for more for 90 days, that we can waive if there's an unusual change in circumstances, and that everyone is advised, if you're going onto the wait list, that there's actually a transfer policy, and therefore there's an active marketplace you could go to. So the other aspect of the AC recommendation is that the position is based when the request was approved, and you only get one approved requirement, and that finally the last part of the AC recommendation is that we'll provide on a first approved basis address blocks available, and anything once you've been approved, you're removed from the wait list. So it's the change is predominantly adding the limits of a /22 and no more than total space of /20 held by the organization. When we did the legal review, we commented that We understand the policy, and so it would be a cap even if someone could qualify for more. And the policy was updated. The legal counsel, there was a strong support for this because of obviously when you have a situation of fraud against the organization, having a limits the amount of damage that could be done by someone who interprets that fraud. The staff updated the policy so AC updated the policy to clarify some staff comments, and it was actually adopted by the board, as I noted, on July 10th. So, even though it was an abbreviated process, because that's what in an emergency, that's what the emergency PDP calls for, it still was developed by the AC, went to the community, went to public comment in the community, and we ended up not having a suspended policy for very long. You folks originally adopted the waitlist policy saying issue space. The Board of Trustees actually stopped your policy so that it could be amended in this manner and then restarted it as fast as possible. The emergency PDP isn't often used, but we will use it if necessary to protect the interests of the organization. So, with that having all been said, we didn't really have a time for a discussion at the community. That wasn't really an opportunity. We'd like to have a discussion now. Do you agree with that policy? Do people have concerns about the change that were made? Also, now that we've made those changes to the waiting list policy, are there now subsequent changes or anything further that the community thinks is appropriate in that area of the PDP? So, we made an emergency change. It's been implemented. Microphones are open to discuss the waiting list policy. I'm now going to ask the vice chair to come up to moderate the cues.
Thank you, John. All right, back microphone.
Hi, Mike Burns from IP Trading. I do support generally the changes and the utilization of the emergency policy development process here in response to the fraud. But one of the issues I have is that by including the limit of a /20 for holders to come and access the waiting list, we are angling towards a new entrant policy without any discussion of that. So the other RIRs have specifically discussed policies designed to encourage new entrants to have access to reserved IPv4 pools. We've never done that here, and in the past, in the context of discussions about removing needs tests and setting certain block sizes that would qualify for a transfer without a needs test, objections were raised that this goes against the interests of larger members. And I think it's fair for us to discuss if we want a new entrants policy, if we want to elevate new entrants over old members, it's something we should talk about. And that's my comment.
Thank you, John. Go ahead.
If I could ask you a question before you, given that we've sort of backed into a policy, would you propose, based on your thoughts of new entrants and the barriers that are posed one way or another by having the /20 as a total size limit, do you believe the current policy is appropriate, or would you refine it somehow with further change? Is there a particular change you'd propose at this time?
I'm undecided. I think it's something that we should discuss. It's different. You know, we haven't discriminated really beyond dues between large members or old members and small members and new members. And now we're doing that kind of unilaterally without a normal policy development process. As for my opinion, I don't like any reserved or free pools. I don't think that they are consistent with a trading market existing at the same time, and they're a magnet for fraud and for abuse. And my understanding of the waiting list policy when it was first being developed was this was going to be an interim stopgap measure to deal with IANA returns primarily. My understanding was that there would be little incentive for revocations and returns to take place given the value of the addresses, which always is larger than, you know, the back dues. And I just anticipated it would be unlikely that people would voluntarily return their addresses when they know that they could sell them for money. So I always assumed this was going to be a temporary thing, and that would eventually taper off. But in the event, it's turned out not to be the case. And, you know, with the influx of Amir's addresses, that really gave a lot of extra lifetime to the waiting list. And reducing the maximum allocation size to a /22 also extends the waiting list. So in general, if we're going to prioritize new members, give them access that existing members don't have, I would like to hear arguments for and against that before I come to a decision.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Front center microphone.
Thank you. Chris Tassett, Tassett Law, ARIN AC. I think that the balance struck in the current waitlist policy is appropriate, and I know there are a couple of policies working their way through that we're going to discuss, one that makes some proposes some further changes, one of which is a clarification and another a constraint, another one that would do away with the waitlist. I would suggest that we actually give the revised policy as currently implemented some time to work its way through and see what the policy experience is until the next meeting before we try to tinker more with this substantively. If there are actual clarifications that need to be made because something isn't clear in the policy and one of the policy elements of one proposed policy has such a clarification, that's fine. But in terms of either releasing the constraints or making them more stringent, I just think it's premature. We need to give it some time to work its way through. Unless, of course, people want to do away with the wait list entirely, which is a totally different discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Far microphone.
Chris Woodfield, Salesforce, ARIN, AC. First off, the comment I stood up to make was a comment that Chris also made, so I'll not make that comment because it will just be repeated. But to address an earlier comment, I think my memory of the mindset behind putting in the /20 limitation is the idea that an organization that already has a substantial amount of address space is far more likely to better positioned to obtain additional space over via the transfer market as opposed to the waiting list. So in my opinion, I think it's fair to, whether or not you want to call it a new entrance policy, whatever you want to call it, my personal opinion is that it is fair to say that the waiting address space obtained from the waiting list should be earmarked for smaller organizations and organizations without the resources to obtain their space via the transfer market.
Thank you. Front center.
Owen DeLong, ARIN AC. I'm going to first echo what Chris and Chris have said. I think that Mr. Burns in his comments kind of conflated small entities and new entrants in a way that isn't necessarily entirely accurate. I don't think they're one and the same, as he kind of seemed to express. The reality is it would be great if we could do something that didn't discriminate large versus small in IPv4 policy here, but we can't. There is no possible way to serve large users adequately in the current environment. There is not enough address space available. In case nobody noticed, we're basically out of v4. If you want address space available to serve your new large organization or even your existing large organization, hey, there's lots of v6 and it would be really good if people used it. It would be far better for all of us if we could, get over this v4 addiction and move on to v6. But what we're doing here with this policy is the art of the possible. It is possible for us to serve smaller organizations to some extent with the resources we have available. It is not possible to serve larger organizations to the same extent. Sorry. So I think we've struck a good balance. If people think that a different balance would be better, I certainly would like to hear from them about what that balance would be and what it would look like. I don't favor eliminating the waiting list. I think that it is serving a constituency of the ARIN community quite well, and I think that it will continue to do so as best we can. But there's a limit to what we can do within the constraints that are available, and I think we're doing the best we can with that.
Thanks,
Not
Ron.
trying to discriminate.
Far microphone.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. I'm extremely supportive of the fact that the EPDP was utilized in this case. I want to make sure that the EPDP is used because of its power and the way it's done, specifically for the issue that is there. And I will agree, I really want to echo what Mike Burns said. The /20 was a complete overreach. It did not deal, or was not needed to deal, with the fraudulent problem. It should have been left out. It should have been done separately. We have now gone effectively through a rapid process and added on what is effectively a new entrant policy now without community discussion. Dealing with the fraud was absolutely appropriate, and I felt that there was a right balance that was given to the rest of the text. So my only recommendation at this point is strip out that one line with the /20. It is not relevant to dealing with the problem, and let the community start a new policy discussion on new entrant policies or whatever the case may be. But I'm deeply concerned with that addition. It changes 10, 15 years of expectation about soft landing versus hard landing, etc. As a small company, I'm excluded now, and I don't believe that it is up for the advisory council in this particular case to be deciding who is small. Deal with the fraud, which was what the EPDP was for.
Thank you. Closing the queues now, so if you have anything further to add, please join the queues. John?
Kevin, I just wanted to respond. To the extent that you believe the policy would be better without that constraint of /20, there's a way to submit policy proposals, and a number of AC members here who can help you with that if you wish to make a proposal to that.
John, I believe it should be the other way around. Using the EPDP, that should not have been in there to deal with this issue. The AC and the community, if they felt that that should be there, should have started a policy after that and gone through the long tail of a proper policy process.
Understood, but now that we are with the policy as it is, if you believe it should be changed, you should submit one.
I'm answering your questions to the community if I feel this should
Understood.
be changed.
Front microphone.
Joe Provo, Google, ARIN AC. I want to echo. I don't want to echo on the microphone. I want to echo my colleagues, Mr. Tess and Mr. Woodfield, regarding the original reasons I stepped up to the microphone. But I do want to point out to the extreme strict nature that has some bones of contention. I agitated for that. I'll take some brickbats for that if people think that's terrible. We all agreed to it, but the intent was to actually restart the process and then come back to the community and get things moving. And that some of these numbers, some of these values were based on the data that we had. That's the one point that I haven't heard yet, that we actually had data that this would functionally restart things and not be a significant blocker for a lot of folks that were actually in queue.
Thank you. Far microphone.
Kevin Morgan, Stratus Networks. Kevin before me said almost exactly what I was going to say, so I don't need to be repetitive. I think that there's definitely better ways to deal with the fraud than put the /20 limitation in there, and that a change this major needs a longer vet by the entire community and how many people it affected to rip that, put that restriction on there, which effectively removed people from a list that they were on.
Thank you. Far microphone again.
Rob Seastrom, Packet, also on the ARIN AC. I'd like to respond specifically to Kevin. Our concern was addressing the fraud. There was stuff put in there that is easier to roll back than to roll forward. Things like the 5-year hold time. That's something that you can easily say, well, you know, we had a community consultation, and actually the community really, really thinks that like 2 years and 8 months is the optimal number. So we're gonna roll it back, and nobody screams that they were hurt by this, by pulling it in. So likewise, doing a restriction where we didn't really have one before is something that could be unwound with minimal damage. And so I supported it at the time. I support having some sort of a restriction now. And I encourage Kevin to bring us policy proposals, and I'll even help write one if you think that the community needs to unwind that or push it to a different prefix length.
Briefly, we'll allow Kevin to respond there.
Thank you. I just want to clarify. My concern is this was done as part of the EPDB process. It did not go through a full meeting, and the litmus test that is used for that process should have been far more stringent. We all know that once we start a new policy process, it's a long, involved process. We have added in a significant restriction that I've not been convinced was to deal with the fraud issue into it, and that is my concern. I am more concerned about how we use the EPDP and how we overreach on the EPDP than I am about making a new policy and winding back some things. I don't believe this sentence has anything to do with the problem that the EDP was called out to use.
And the counter to that is that we did in fact get a proposal that only changed the prefix length, only put a limit in and did nothing else, and that there's at least a section of the community that thinks that merely doing that would have been sufficient to remove the fraud incentive by making the transaction size so much smaller. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Can I just say one thing? There was a proposal in place by my organization for just that. Restrict the maximum allocation to a /22. And I have to agree with Kevin that the larding on of the /20 limit had nothing to do with that fraud. And it was an example of policy development that should have had a debate. And that's it.
Thank you. Any remote participants, Leif?
No, I just wanted to make, sorry, I don't use this very often. I did want to make a
State
comment.
your name for the
about
record,
that.
please.
Oh, sorry, Tina Morris, Amazon and Advisory Council Chair. The /22 limit, we know for a fact, wouldn't eliminate fraud. We've seen this happen in RIPE. We took those experiences and brought that to this policy. It was very intentional.
The problem in RIPE had to do with new entrants getting free addresses. It's not the same thing as a waiting list, having to demonstrate addresses.
John?
A question for the speaker. So the question is, if the AC was unable to converge on a recommendation, then the waitlist policy would remain suspended indefinitely?
Yeah, I would prefer that.
You would have preferred that?
I
That's
would
what
have
wanna
rather
know.
had a debate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For the community, I note, I'm doing two things here. One, I'm trying to understand feedback on what happened, both from where we are with policy and whether you folks want to make more proposals to the AC, but also for the PDP process, because I maintain this errata sheet, which is an amusing document, and it's possible that having, as we've exercised this emergency PDP, that a future version might be more constrained or put circumstances on. That's why I want to understand what outcome you desire. Thank you.
All right. If there's none remote, then we'll call it closed, and I'll pass it back to you, John. We'd like to remind the remote participants that if you have comments or questions to add, please send them through the process. We do have a moderator here on stage that can relay your comments into the record.
Thank you.